Okay, so we're going to take a look at a Spanish game where both sides play a bit more conventionally and conservatively, and they're just developing their pieces until a little bit later in the opening. You might see a lot of games like this. So basically, we're to look at a game where black chooses not to play a6, even though we just looked at all the reasons why black would like to or oftentimes should play a6. Oftentimes they don't, and we need to see what type of a game might occur. And just as we saw before with white choosing sometimes to make this pawn push from the f2 pawn, black can also play that way. There's actually an opening which we'll look at later called the Schliemann Gambit for black, which is a very, very aggressive way to play against the Spanish and try to take the initiative. We're not going to look at the Schliemann exactly in this particular video, but we're going to look at a similar type of play, and I want you guys to be prepared for what to do against it. So in this case, we're going to have black simply play d6 and defend this pawn and get this bishop out ready to make this pin on the knight. We know that in Spanish, if we know what we're doing, we're not worried about the pin, but it's still a sort of a motif that black can play, and it's still a natural move. So we go ahead and just defend our pawn as well. So we'll make a sort of a symmetrical move and get our bishop out as well, and they will make that pin, and then we will take our knight out to break the pin. So in the Spanish, we aren't worried about this pin for a couple of different reasons. We have multiple ways to break it, basically. Usually, the main way to break a pin, as we say, is this knight move right here. You put the knight to d2, or if you're black, it might be d7 or whatever, and that way you can move your queen, and if the opponent chooses to take the knight, you take back with the knight, and it doesn't mess up your pawn chain. Whereas usually, you don't want this pin to happen because the knight can't move, and so you move your queen somewhere, but then if they take the knight, if the only piece we have to take back with is the pawn, it can mess up our pawn chain. So this is the main way to break a pin. The other way oftentimes, and in this case we can't do it because our pawn chain is blocking our bishop out right now, is a lot of times you can just simply bring your bishop back and cover it and then potentially trade the bishops off. But in Spanish, we have more than one way. So we can put the knight here, and then as we saw before, we also could put the c pawn on c3, and then that gives us a place for the queen to go. And it's a natural move for the queen oftentimes to be on c2 because it aims at multiple parts of the board, and it allows your pieces to develop. Just by moving the queen over to here, you are letting your rook get out more easily, you're letting your bishop get out more easily, you're letting the rooks connect more easily after you castle. So a lot of different times, the queen is very naturally placed on c2. In the Spanish, that is also often the case, depending on what happens. So let's say black now decides to kind of move the knight out belatedly. In chess, there's a general rule of thumb that you normally want to develop your knights before bishops. It doesn't always mean you should do that every game, but in general, getting your knights out into the center is a good idea. Just like in general, not moving your queen out too early is a good idea. Castling early is a good idea. And if you generally follow these rules most of the time, you're going to get a pretty good position. It's just a good thing to do. As you get better at chess and you take more courses like this one, you will learn when you can make exceptions and delay castling or develop the bishops before the knights, etc., etc. We learn how when we can break the rules of thumb and become a better player. So we're going to continue with our knight maneuver that we already learned. Get it over to g3. Let's say black wants to prepare castling. We move our knight up. We don't put the bishop, or we don't put the question to the bishop yet by moving the pawn to h3. We move the knight first and get it ready. He thinks, okay, I'm going to maintain this pin. This knight is pinned, but it's really not effective at all. Let's say he does go ahead and castle. Now, when we move the pawn up, basically the black bishop has to retreat to a square like e6, because as we learned before, if he decides now to try to back up to h5, he's going to lose a pawn due to the same maneuver we saw before. We can take it, and when he takes back with his knight, now his knight is undefended. We have a discovered attack from the queen, and our knight can go ahead and take this pawn, because if they just take back our knight, then we can take their knight with our queen. We're going to gain a pawn in that trade. So there's another saying in chess, loose pieces drop off. In this case, if a knight is hanging over here, it's not directly under threat, but it's under the threat of a discovered attack. it's always dangerous to leave any piece unprotected. And this is why if you watch Grandmaster games, you notice they set up their pieces so efficiently, they almost never will leave a piece totally undefended. Everything they do supports everything else they do. And so their pieces are coordinated, they're defended, they're aimed at some very specific goal, as we learned earlier about how Bobby Fischer would find some specific goal, some target, some weakness, and he would just focus maniacally on that one weakness, and he would never stray from that. He wouldn't let himself be distracted by the opponent's moves, unless, of course, sometimes we have to make a prophylactic move, as I already explained. Okay, so now the black piece basically has to move back, and so that pin was basically a useless move. The bishop had to move twice. It moved out to make this pin, and then later on it had to move back here, which is an inefficient chess. So if you're going to make this pin and later on just have to move back, it's generally not a very good idea, unless of course it creates some sort of weakness in white's move. And of course, having the pawn here in h3, it's not a weakness. This is usually a pretty good place, or is oftentimes a very good place to have the pawn, because now neither the bishop nor the knight can come down to this g4 square and threaten anything. So let's say we go ahead and continue with our normal setup of the Spanish, and we play the pawn to c3. And in this case, since there's no pin and everything, the main point of this move, as before, is to restrict this knight from coming down, and also to prepare to play d4. At some point in the Spanish, in most cases, we're going to play d4 at some point. We want to strike in the center and get space for our pieces. It's just a very thematic move that makes sense. Let's say black does something like this. Now I want to show you guys what we should be thinking of if black moves their knight right here. Why would they do that? If we just think, well, they're just rearranging their pieces and we don't think too much of it, this is a big mistake. And in chess, we always want to think very, very carefully about, okay, why did my opponent do that? What is he hoping to gain? If we do something natural, like now we're just going to castle, we're going to, I wouldn't call it a blunder, but it would be a pretty big mistake, because black now can play this pawn move to f5. And this is a really good move, and all of a sudden black has the initiative. Because, as we've already learned, if I go ahead and just take that pawn, I'm going to be activating black's pieces, and now black will have very active pieces over here with this open file aimed down towards my king. So just see what would happen if we take here and choose to take back with the bishop. I mean, yes, we can just trade off that bishop if we want to, but we're helping black coordinate his pieces. And we can say, well, I'm going to make it, I mean, we can't move the knight here and make the move. We can't move the knight anywhere. We can't attack that rook directly without making a bad move, like, something like g4, which we don't want to do. And in any case, he can just back up. But what he's able to do now is he can move his queen over, he can create a battery, and all of a sudden black has the initiative, and we're on the defensive, and his pieces are going to come out quickly. Okay, so that small seeming mistake of letting him play this f5 move is leading basically to a change of the whole entire position, to black having the initiative. So it's a really big mistake to let this happen. Also, if we don't take it and we do some other move, like let's say we want to move this knight out of the way and prepare because we know he's going to play this next move, or let's say we do something, okay, well, I'm just going to trade this knight off here and stack his pawns just to gain something. But now black is threatening to play f5. So depending on what we choose to do next, let's say we move our knight out of the way, something like this, he can play down here, and now we are kind of cramped. Our pieces are all cramped up, and black's pieces have a lot of space to operate and attack our king side, which we wanted to do against them. In a previous lecture, you saw we did this very thing to black and not to white. And so now we're cramped, black has more space, and it was all because we didn't see this move here, this pawn push. And we should have seen it, because once the knight moves out of the way, the only logical reason for the knight to do that in this particular case is because he wants to play pawn to f5. Okay, so that would be something that would be a really big mistake, and we simply would want to avoid it. However, I will say the best thing to do once he does play this is to strike in the center ourselves and play d4. This would be the way to combat it, because now, okay, he may push this down, but we're threatening to push this up and win a piece. We're threatening to take right here and open things up in the center, and so everything is still balanced. Okay, so let's just look. If he decides to push this pawn down, we can simply move the knight over, You know, if he decides he needs to take this pawn, which he is going to need to do, because otherwise we're going to fork this knight and this bishop with the next move, he pretty much is going to have to play this, and we can take back here, and now we have a very strong center. We're still threatening to play d5, and everything is okay. But still, black would like to play that move f5 and open the board up. He can now do something like maybe just play this move d5, try to gain some space for his pieces. And even though we probably have an advantage in this case by simply playing something like e5, everything is going pretty well for us. He has lodged his pawn right here. Although actually we can actually take that. We have 2 pieces on it. So he wouldn't want to play this yet. He wants to defend this. He probably would need to play something like bishop here. He needs to defend this pawn now. Since he's pushed his pawn down here, it gains him space. He needs to defend it. And if we decide to trade, he can bring his queen over and he can continue to defend it. So basically, the point is if he plays this move, we need to play d4. That's a critical move for us to play in order to keep the game good for us. Okay. So he's got lots of different things he can do here. It's a good game, and we're going to be struggling in the center, but white's still going to have the best of it. So just remember, you got to play d4 in that case. However, we can avoid the whole entire situation because once he plays knight to d7 here, instead of castling, we should see, okay, he's going to play f5, and so we should simply beat him to it, and we should play d4 first. Don't worry about castling. Our king's not in any danger. In this case, we can delay it a little bit and just play d4 ourself. Now, if he plays that, we can fork his knight and bishop and win a piece. So he no longer has the option to play it immediately. He's going to have to react to what we do. So we're beating him to it by recognizing what his plan is, okay? So in this case, he's more or less either forced to take this pawn or to move one of these pieces out of the way. There's not really a good way to do that. So he pretty much has to take our pawn. In which case now we're building a very strong center and we have more space. And of course now this move doesn't really work because it's kind of an awkward move, and you know, we could do lots of different things here. We could ignore it and just defend this pawn. We can take it. See what happens if we simply take it. Maybe we back up our bishop, threatens rook, we can go back. And now we can get our pieces out and aim at his king. He has to react to us. And we've got a pretty good game here, I would say. More space, more active pieces. Let's go back and see if that's the best play. Because basically, if we do this, and he plays f5 anyway, yeah, we can go here and win a piece, so we can't play f5 yet. If he takes it, we take, and he plays f5 like I just showed. We just saw that if we do take that, it actually makes black's position not so bad. So we want to look at some alternatives. Actually, he can't do that because we still have this. We still have this fork. So we can't play f5 now. We basically stopped him from playing that, and we have a really nice situation here. Also, just note, anytime your knight and your bishop are set up 2 squares apart from each other like this, you are at risk of being forked by a pawn. So just something to be aware of. It's a pattern that strong players are always aware of, not putting their pieces like this, or if they do have their pieces set up like this, be very wary of any pawn moves. A lot of times beginning players and lower level players, they overlook this and then they lose a piece and then lose the game. I mean, you should know by now that if you lose a whole entire minor piece against any kind of a good player, the game is virtually over unless they blunder and lose a piece themselves. If you're down a whole piece, all your opponent has to do is trade off all the pieces and then win in an endgame. So it's really too much to be down a whole piece, which is why grandmasters, they drop a piece for some reason due to awesome tactics or a blunder, they pretty much just resign at that point because there's no point in struggling on for hours in a game that is already lost. So just be sure that the lesson here is that if your opponent makes a mysterious knight move like this, A lot of times it's because they want to move the pawn forward that was behind it, and then we can react accordingly. If we react well, we're going to outmaneuver our opponent, and we're going to get a really good game and really good position. And then secondly, be aware always of where you set up your knights and bishops in terms of spacing to each other so you don't fall victim to this pawn fort.